Everyone, just testing audio.
Yep, Nate, you're good.
Great.
Yeah, welcome
everyone.
everyone. Welcome everyone who's joined us. We're just giving a few minutes to get organized here. You can see on the screen is just some thoughts for your pondering as we get started. This is the results of a question we asked participants in the first workshop. So just for your reflection as we're waiting for others to join.
What is
Okay, but that's
yeah.
Is it reasonable to ask a question of a Paso Electric on their presentation in advance? I have a specific question on one item in it.
So, Alan, we're going to have you hold the question until the relevant session. We're breaking up the presentation into 4 pieces, and so we'll give you an opportunity to ask your question verbally, depending on which of the 4 segments it applies to. So we will hold until that point as we're just about to get started.
Okay, my expectation is that it's a mistake. I was hoping to give them a chance to correct it before we started.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We'll hold to that point.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Margie Tatro from GridWorks. We welcome you to the second workshop in the stakeholder engagement process for El Paso Electric Company's integrated resource plan for the next 20 years. It's Tuesday, the 25th, 1 p.m. We are recording this meeting so that if you wish to go back and re-listen to pieces of the meetings or the workshops, feel free to do so. The link to this recording will be included in the meeting summary that we send out. So Deb, could you go to slide 2, please? Again, and all the material for this workshop, as with all the workshops we're hosting, are available on the gridworks.org website. That link is here, and we'll include that again toward the end of the workshop. So, next slide, please. Our goal today is really to deepen all of the stakeholders' understanding of the variety of issues that are present in the IRP process. And what we thought was important to talk about today is that all aspects of resource planning, from inputs to modeling to outputs to regulations to requirements to opportunities and challenges, all of those issues are important for stakeholders to understand. So our objective today is to deepen everyone's understanding of all aspects of this resource planning, and also to build rapport within the community such that stakeholders and the EPE and E3 team are working as a collective entity as we collaborate in this process. So our agenda today, after a welcome and a review of the prior work, we will turn to the EPE team for a series of 4 different presentations. Each presentation will include 20 minutes of content from the EPE E3 team and then 10 minutes for questions and answers for that particular topic. We'll take a break in between the first 2 presentations and the second 2 presentations, and we've also allowed for another 30 minutes of question and answer before we summarize and adjourn for the day. So please be thinking of your questions as we go along. I'll give you some more guidance on our plan for how to handle questions. Again, it's important that we are learning about the current requirements and opportunities. And although many of you have been involved in IRPs in the past, there may be some new context, some new terminology, some new requirements, some new aspects that would be helpful for you to understand. So the next slide, Deb, shows a couple of guidance and some tips and norms that we'd like to adopt. First of all, a couple of Zoom tips, just reminders. Please mute your mic when you're not talking. Please raise your hand when you wish to speak. And if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you go to the reactions button at the bottom menu screen from Zoom, if you go to react, you will see a raise hand option. Please get familiar with that because we're going to use that primarily for our question and answer sessions today. We're going to reserve the chat for some very specific questions we ask of you, and we're going to encourage the coming off camera and off mute to pose your questions that you have when you indicate by raising your hand. So please become comfortable with the raise hand function. If you have questions, please go ahead and send a chat to Deborah Shields and she can assist you with any technology matters. Again, we'll use the chat for some very specific purposes later on. And please turn your camera on when you're talking so that we can see your fabulous smiling faces. A couple of norms we'd like to suggest during the presentations. Please do hold your questions until the Q&A session. As I mentioned, we'll have time after each of the 4 presentations, as well as a general Q&A session toward the end of this workshop. Please be respectful in your comments and give each other the benefit of the doubt. We're all working with good intentions and hopefully as collaboratively as possible and coming up with the best plan that we can devise together. Please share your ideas and leave time for others. So that's enough for the guidance and the norms. The next slide describes some review of what we covered in workshop 1. As you recall, we asked the 70 plus stakeholders in attendance for their level of familiarity and knowledge about the IRP planning process. And of the 70 or so who responded, there were 25% that said that they're either new to this process or they have a low level of understanding. A good chunk said they have some knowledge, and 31% said they have pretty good familiarity. So just recognizing that we have a diversity of knowledge bases in the room, we're going to try to tailor our process starting in workshop number 3 to address the very different levels of knowledge and familiarity in this process. So stay tuned for that. We'll have separate tracks for general and introductory kind of knowledge in workshop 3, and we'll have a more detailed modeling track for those who want to get into the nitty-gritty details of modeling numbers. So please keep that in mind. Now, I realize we may have some people who are new to our process. If you did not attend workshop number 1, we'd like to invite you to go to the chat, insert your name, your organization, and perhaps one topic of primary interest to you in this IRP planning process. So anybody who's new, who did not attend workshop 1, please feel free to go to the chat and introduce your name, organization, and a topic of interest so that we get that recorded into our system. Also, we all asked for the stakeholder to contribute that that idea, that topic, that priority interest that they had in this process. And what you can see in the next slide, I'm going to sneeze. I apologize. Okay, I'm not going to sneeze. Allergy season right here in New Mexico. What you can see in this next slide is what's called a word cloud. And this depicts the key words that you all suggested in your topics of interest at workshop number 1. The size of the font indicates the number of people who used that key phrase or key word in their contribution when they're suggesting their topic of greatest interest. Smaller fonts mean that that term was suggested fewer numbers of time. This just for your knowledge, one of the things we observed in looking at this is the issues of reliability showed up in a very few numbers, and safety didn't show up at all, which is interesting. Don't know what that means. It could be that's not top of mind for folks. Could mean that the utility is doing a great job with reliability and safety already, and so it's not top of mind for people. There may be other implications, but this is what we created after the workshop number 1. We will probably not revise this, but we will consider the new topics that people are inputting into the chat today to see if there's any major change in this word cloud. So that's what we did at the first workshop. We also had some general discussion about challenges and opportunities the utility is facing. And in the next slide, you'll see how we are depicting the integrated resource planning process in a bit more detail. So this slide number 8 shows something that we will get much more into detail into in the next 2 workshops. As you see, modeling inputs that range from load forecasting, supply and demand side resources, market interactions, fuel and commodity prices, and transmission considerations are all very important inputs into the modeling that EPE and E3 will do. And we're going to get some presentations today to start digging into those particular topics, and we will be able to dig even further detail in workshop number 3. Then this third column in green, scenario design, sensitivity analysis, and regulatory and resource adequacy requirements are additional inputs into the modeling process. We will dig into those. We will start talking about scenario design and sensitivity analysis in workshop number 3. And you'll hear some about regulatory and resource adequacy requirements, some today and even more in workshop number 3. This fourth column in orange is the intersection of the variety of models that are typically run, and they are interactive, they're iterative, they involve production cost modeling, capacity expansion modeling, and the assessment of those portfolios against resource adequacy requirements. There is some potential feedback and revision in this whole process, and this will all be a focus of our workshops 4 through 7. At the end of the day, some of the outputs that come from the modeling and the input from all stakeholders is to evaluate the portfolios within those sensitivities and scenarios that were suggested. There'll be a chance for all of us to articulate the results of that modeling in what's called a statement of need. Then an action plan of actions for the next 3 years for the utility will be discussed. And then finally, the utility will be able to move forward with their other utility proceedings, including the process for acquiring new resources if required. This diagram comes from Lawrence Berkeley Lab and Synapse Energy's work on best practices in IRP planning. We've done a few modifications to tailor this to the New Mexico and EPE process, but we do have that reference available if folks want to read through the IRP best practices that's been published in 2024 by Berkeley Lab and Synapse Energy. So that's what we've drawn upon for this diagram. We plan to use this in our whole process going forward, just to keep track of where we are and where we're going. So with that, Deb, could you please go to the next slide? At this point, we are going to turn the stage over to the EPE team. As I mentioned, we'll have 20 minutes for 4 different presentations, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A for each one. Please hold your questions until the Q&A session. In fact, you might want to jot them down on a piece of paper, because at the end of each presentation, we will ask for a show of hands for people who have questions for the presenters. If we run out of time, we may ask you to put those questions into chat, but we are going to begin with having the raised hands and have you come off mic to pose your question. So please hold those until the Q&A sessions, and you might be thinking about what was not clear. Where did you maybe see something that didn't sit right or look right? What concerns do you have? And what do you need more information about? You may have other questions, but that's a good start for you to be thinking about your questions. So before we turn the stage over to Emmanuel Villalobos, the first speaker from El Paso Electric, let me pause and see if there any hands would be raised for questions at this point in our process. Okay, seeing no hands raised, let's go ahead and stop our sharing. Deb, oh yeah, here's the one more slide, sorry. Here are the topics that will be presented so you can gather your thoughts about questions: energy demand forecasting, planning reserve margin and capacity accreditation. We will take a 10-minute break after that particular presentation and the Q&A session, and then hear more about resource options and technologies, and then capacity expansion modeling. So with that, let me turn it over to Emmanuel for the first presentation from El Paso Electric. Again, please hold your questions to the Q&A session.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our second workshop. So I'm Emmanuel Villalobos. I'm the Director for Market Development and Resource Strategy at El Paso Electric. You're going to notice that we have several different presenters in the room, subject matter experts in the room, as well as online. So you're going to be hearing from a lot of us again today. So as I mentioned, this is our second workshop. The last time we spent the majority of the workshop just introducing you to EPE, our service territory, who we are, what we do. Today, we're going to dig a little deeper, another level down. We're not going to get down into real detail or talking about any results of any kind, because we're not there yet in the process. What we are going to be doing, though, is adding on to that next knowledge base that you all will need in order to go with us on this resource planning trip. So we're going to keep it relatively high level, some of these technical concepts, and then we're going to dig into the tutorials here. Do the next slide. So this is just our standard safe harbor statement. It's included in the presentation. Go to the next slide. So the overview of the IRP. Next slide. So this is the statement of need as it's written in the rule. At the core of the IRP is your statement of need. It's going to identify what resources you're going to need, the type of resources, the amount, how you're going to meet your demand. I think the biggest takeaway here is that this process is not just about looking for addressing peak load growth. You also have to address aging resource retirements, your reliability reserves, resource adequacy, any state mandated renewable programs, energy storage, emerging technology. So by understanding what our evolving needs are as a system, you can ensure that your future grid is going to be more cost-effective and resilient. On to the next slide. Thank you. So at the heart, I think, of the IRP is the action plan. So the action plan is going to outline the specific steps that the utility can take over the next 3 years to implement the findings of the IRP. So the IRP is going to include, the action plan is going to include specific components to resource procurement, updates on RFPs, resource procurements. It will help to inform regulatory filings and compliance. It will deal with more stakeholder engagement. So this is the main part of what we're going to be talking about, or one of the parts that we're going to be talking about for the IRP plan. So this next slide here, I think, just works to kind of emphasize again what the stakeholder process is going to look like. So as I mentioned, today we are on workshop 2. If you see the graphic online, workshops 1 through 3 are going to be the shared knowledge foundation. So that's what we're trying to accomplish in these first workshops, is building on that knowledge that you're going to need in order to help us effectively go through the next 2 sections. There were a lot of really great questions from the first workshop. We will be addressing those, and I really appreciate the enthusiasm behind a lot of the questions. The only thing I will say is be patient, bear with us, because a lot of the questions that we had been receiving were focused on output results and future plans, and all of which will be addressed, but in later portions along the process. So we will plan to file our IRP September 1st of 2025. There will be a lot of stakeholder engagement between now and then. And again, we just want to emphasize that we want to give everybody the opportunity to learn the process, be more well-versed in the definitions and concepts as we start to move through. So workshops 1 through 3, we're establishing this foundation, this wealth of knowledge that you're going to need. Workshops 4 through 7 are really going to be in the nitty-gritty of it. We're going to be talking about different scenarios and sensitivities. Essentially, the stakeholders will be helping us build what you want to see in the model. We'll be talking about the capacity expansion, output from the model, until eventually we start to get to what the different resource portfolios are starting to shape up as, and then eventually the statement of need, the action plan, the heart of what we've been discussing. Go to the next slide, please. So again, just tying it back to a lot of the questions that we had gotten. We started to receive questions last time on what are the different resources that we're expecting? How will we be meeting our renewable portfolio standards in the future? What is our capacity and energy mix? What is that going to look like? There were, I believe, some questions on system costs, and these are all, again, great questions, but they're all mostly focused towards modeling output rather than building on the knowledge base. So again, please, I encourage all questions. We are taking them all into consideration. We are categorizing your questions, and they're helping us to inform what the future presentations and different workshops are going to look like. So please send us everything you got. They will be addressed in due time. We just want to give everybody, as GridWorks had mentioned, there's some folks that are very well versed in the process and some that are not. We're just trying to give everybody who's not well versed in the process an opportunity to catch up and have that same knowledge base so we can all move forward together. This next slide here, I really like because it gives a good visual representation of how we're looking at the resource planning from the utilities perspective. So in the near term, years 1 through 3, this is where you're going to see management of your risk portfolio. It's going to be implementation of the immediate tasks from your action plan. It's basically going to be all of the near-term decisions that you can use in order to optimize the utility, the tools that the utility currently has. When you start to get into that midterm in the timeline, when you're looking at years 3 through 10, this is where we start to look at a little more of the capacity expansion. We're looking at what type of RFPs we're going to be issuing, what type of resources we would be looking at, our procurement. We'll be looking at factors like our load growth and resource adequacy, different changes in our system, changes to transmission plans. So your midterm area here is really where your RFP takes place, just because of the time that it takes to issue and evaluate, and for bidders to execute contracting and actually building of a facility. You're looking at, decisions that you make today or identify today could take 4, 5, or 6 years before you actually see these resources actually come online onto your system. The longer term view of the IRP, this is really looked at more for future policy, decarbonization, emerging technology, things that we have to keep an eye on that will eventually inform the midterm and your near-term decision-making process. We can go to the next slide, and this is where I'm going to pass it on to Kennedy.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sanedina Soto, and I'm the manager of the Load Research and Data Analytics Department. Our department is in charge of developing the company's long-term forecast. So for my presentation today, I'll be providing you all with a general overview of the forecast. But in the following meeting, workshop 3, we'll revisit the forecast in more detail. My presentation today will focus on the components that make up the forecast. We'll also take a look at the company's growth history, and then we'll also look forward to our expected growth and what are the factors driving that growth. So EPE's long-term forecast is a monthly forecast with a 20-year horizon. For the purpose of this IRP, however, we did extend that horizon through 2050. The forecast is used to determine how much generation and transmission is needed for the future. So the forecast is vital because EPE needs to be able to have adequate capacity to meet demand at all times. So our forecast is made up of the following: the billed energy sales forecast, a billed demand forecast, the native system energy forecast, the native system demand forecast, and customer forecast. We'll be focusing today on the native system energy forecast and the native system demand forecast. Our base forecast does assume normal weather for our projections. However, I did want to mention that we do look at various weather scenarios to account for different weather assumptions that could occur. So in addition to what we just looked at, we also include 4 out-of-model adjustments in our forecast. These adjustments are meant to account for growth in distributed generation customers, the continued growth of electric vehicles in our region, energy efficiency, and expected new load from large load customers. Our DG forecast, can we go back to the... So our DG forecast is made up of 7 different scenarios, which account for low to high adoption rates. And in a similar fashion, we also have various scenarios for our EV forecast. But in addition to the various scenarios, we also have a forecast for light duty, medium duty, heavy duty, and electric buses. The energy efficiency forecast is provided to us by the Energy Efficiency Department. And for expected large load customers, we do receive this information from our key accounts department, who informs us of the new customers that we expect to see in our region, the size of the customers, and the timing. And we make adjustments to our forecast accordingly. Next slide, please. So before we move on, I wanted to take a moment to understand key terms. Let's start off with billed energy sales. So billed energy sales is probably the term that most of us are familiar with, right? This is the electricity that we sell to our customers. It's the number that we all see in our bills. This is typically measured in kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, or gigawatt hours. Native energy is the energy that is generated to meet this consumption. We can also think of native energy as energy consumption plus losses. Native demand represents the highest rate of usage for the year, and it's typically measured in megawatts. So I included the graphic below so we can take a moment to look at the differences between energy and demand. So if you look at the graphic, energy is represented by the shaded region below the curve, and it represents consumption over a period of time. Looking at the same graph, we'll see that the maximum demand for this day was 2,316, and this is represented by a point along the curve. So it represents consumption at a moment in time. Another key factor to look at would be the load factor. And the load factor is a measure of how efficiently the electric energy is used. It is typically measured as a percentage, expressed as a percentage, and it ranges between 0 and 100. So the higher the load factor, the more efficiently the electrical energy is used. And the lower the load factor implies that, we have to build additional generation to meet this need, but this generation isn't necessarily being used efficiently throughout the whole year. Yeah, next slide, please. So let's take a look at how El Paso Electric has grown over the past 20 years. So to take a look at the table below, we'll see that native energy has grown at a 20-year compounded annual growth rate of 1.29%, while native system peak has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 2.8%, and customers at 1.75%. Focusing in on the last 10 years, native system peak has grown 3 times faster than native energy. And this is due to a couple of factors. First of all, what we're seeing is a change in the customer mix. Specifically, the number of residential customers relative to large commercial customers has been increasing, where residential customers are typically low load factor customers, and large commercial customers tend to have higher load factors. We've also been noticing a decrease in use per customer for all rate classes except the residential class. This decrease can be attributed to increases in the adoption of energy efficiency. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in the saturation rate of refrigerated air conditioning. This, coupled with warming trends, has led to an increase in usage during the summer months that does not translate into the winter months. We're also seeing an increase in the adoption of customer-owned solar rooftops, which once a customer puts solar rooftops in their homes, what we see is they decrease their consumption. However, their peak demand is not increased in an equal manner. Next slide, please. So all of these factors are leading to a decline in the system load factor. So what you'll see is that since 2000, the load factor has gone from 65.4% to a low of 43.8% in 2023. We did see an uptick in 2024 to 45.5%. Next slide. So we already took a look at what the factors are that are contributing to a declining load factor, but I did want to mention that EPE does not expect this trend to continue in the future. As customers continue to adopt electric vehicles, we're going to see improvements in the load factor, specifically through rates that promote off-peak charging, such as the whole house rate in New Mexico. We're also seeing the introduction of new time of day and time varying rates, and also through the introduction of large load customers, specifically data centers. I will mention that data centers are high load factor customers with a load factor typically in the high 90s. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, EPE expects to see a rise in demand at an unprecedented rate. This rise is driven by two main factors, which are the decarbonization of transportation and the AI revolution. So if we take a look here, we'll notice that the load from electric vehicles is significant. For instance, a single light duty EV can consume an average of half of a residential customer's consumption and can create demand spikes between 1.2 for level 1 charging and 19.2 kilowatts for level 2 charging. A medium duty vehicle can consume up to the equivalent of up to 2 residential customers and create spikes as high as 180, while a heavy duty vehicle can create spikes up to 2 megawatts. An electric bus can consume an average of 5 residential customers and create demand spikes as high as 450 megawatts. So while the load that we're seeing from EVs is substantial, this load is dwarfed when compared to data center load, right? So we'll see small data centers can consume anywhere between 1 to 5 megawatts of electricity demand. Hyperscale data centers, on the other hand, can consume between 20 megawatts up to 1 gigawatt of electricity. So what does this mean? So to put this into context, one data center consuming 1 gigawatt of load is equivalent to about 52,000 light-duty EVs using a level 2 charging. 833,000 light-duty vehicles using a level 1 charging. In context of consumption from residential customers, 1 gigawatt is equivalent to the demand produced by over 333,000 residential customers. So to put this in perspective, as of December, there were a total of 96,000 residential customers in New Mexico. Okay, so far, EPE has received 108 formal requests for additional load for customers exceeding 500 kW in New Mexico. Of these, EPE has responded to 26 prospective customers. Okay, so we have been seeing a demand for data center load to come into our region. So this creates a couple of challenges for EPE, specifically as this growth in load will require additional resources. And due to supply chain issues, EPE needs to be more proactive than ever if it wants to capitalize on this potential growth. Next slide, please. So here I'm showing a forecast scenario that includes approximately 500 additional megawatts of additional load from large load customers. So under this scenario, what we'll see is, I don't know if you recall a few slides ago, we were talking about how native energy was growing at about 1.3% a year. And we'll see that with some of this load, we can expect growth rates up to 5% per year for the total system and 3% per year for New Mexico. So this is significant load that we're seeing enter our system. If we focus in on the graph on the right, we'll see in 2026, there's some years where we can expect growth to go over even 16% for New Mexico. So this is significant growth that we're seeing. Next slide. So when we look at native system peak, it's the same story, right? Historically, we're seeing growth rates around 2.8%. This can increase up to 5.3%. New Mexico in particular is seeing growth rates close to 10% in some years. So we're really expecting significant growth. So in summary, EPE is expecting to see growth due to the changing landscape from, the entry of data centers into our region. So that really concludes my presentation, and I'm open to any questions y'all may have.
Thank you so much, Anadina. At this point, we'd like to go ahead and leave the EPE slides up because I imagine they might invoke questions from the group that Anadina, you or others might want to expand on. So please, at this point, go to your React button and raise your hand if you have questions for the EPE team. Yep, I see one from Kathy, help me. Oh, Alan Downs, I think you had the first question. Please go ahead, Alan.
Okay, thank you. My question is on slide 17. I see someone has asked the same question in the chat, and that has to do with the spike in consumption from an electric bus. You show a heavy vehicle, heavy duty EV as having a spike of 2 megawatts, but an electric bus having a spike of 450 megawatts, that's 20% of your system capacity. If 5 buses are charging at once, you don't have any power for anybody else. Is that a real number?
You know what, let me go back and take a look at that number for you, but I believe this is from DC fast charging, but we'll take a look at that and get back to you.
Alan, thank you for the question. We will get back to you with an answer on that. Steve Fishman, I think your hand was up next. Please go ahead.
Whoops, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, there goes video. I had a question about load factor. Is load factor still a relevant measure when you start to get lots of intermittent resources into the mix? So if we're at 50 or 60% intermittent resources, how relevant a measure is load factor, particularly by customer class?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part, Mr. Fishman?
So the last part, I think, was how relevant is load factor when you have all of these intermittent resources as we move forward? And particularly, how relevant is it trying to apply it to customer class, meaning large customer versus residential?
Hey, to the EP folks, do you want me to take the first stab at that?
Yes, please, Ben, thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, and thanks for the question, Mr. Fisherman. This is Ben Elsey from E3 Consulting. So maybe just to take the first part of that question and how important is load factor? It's extremely important when you start looking at capacity expansion modeling and the types of resources that you need to serve load. So typically, if we look at high load factor customers, it means they're going to need energy 8760, so all hours of the year, every year. So that impacts the types of resources that can supply those types of customers. So if you look at, say, a residential customer has a relatively low load factor, you can meet a lot of that load with just solar, maybe 4-hour storage, for example. But if you have a customer like a data center that requires energy a very high load factor, you're going to need more dispatchable resources, more resources that are available when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. So I would say load factor is extremely important when you start looking at the solution for the statement of need. And then how it applies to different customers really kind of falls outside of the realm of the IRP itself and then starts becoming more of a rate allocation issue. So we probably won't be just necessarily justifying load factor as part of the IRP on a customer class basis.
Yeah, okay. I've just seen it used so much in rate making, and that's where I really kind of questioned how relevant it is as the resource mix changes going forward. But I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great. Thank you for the question. I see Phil Simpson. I think you're next with your hand up. Please go ahead, Phil.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my question is on slide 15, and maybe it's more of a comment. I think that the bottom part of the slide on slide 16 talks about factors contributing to an increase in the system load factor. My experience is that my electric vehicle did not contribute a huge amount to my electric bill, but my heat pump did. My heat pump is a very big electrical load, and it occurs at a really great time for El Paso Electric system in terms of occurring mostly in the winter and in the evening hours and the nighttime hours when there's a lot of capacity on the system. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think heat pumps are should be regarded as a very beneficial resource for El Paso Electric in terms of increasing the system load factor.
Yes, thank you. Also, we do produce a residential appliance survey every other month, and we don't see heat pumps being very popular in our region. And as we continue to do that further in the years, maybe we'll start seeing that becoming more common in our area.
Great. Thank you, Enadina. Kara Lynch, I think you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sure. Hi, all. Thanks for hosting this GridWorks and for EPE providing the stakeholder engagement. I know you'll be jumping into resources to deliver the load. I'm just wondering, there's EVs that have bidirectional charging, and of course there's batteries. So how do these factor into the considerations of draw versus output of energy in this IRP?
So for the forecast, that isn't taken into consideration because the number of people with battery and EVs isn't large enough to really make a big contribution to put energy in the system. But that's definitely something we'll continue to monitor and then add as appropriate.
Great question, Kara. Thank you so much. Any other, let's see, the last, we have time for one more question. Anybody else want to add a question on this topic before we move to our next presentation piece? Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of forward installation of resources, I keep hearing that the supply chain for solar is, and particularly large scale solar, is somewhat backed up. And that, if you want to do a large scale new solar facility, it might take 5 or 10 years before you can bring it to fruition. And I'm wondering, how that plays into the scenario of high growth going forward, and what that means in your thinking.
Steve, we might want to hold your question until the resource options and technologies portion of today.
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Sure.
So yeah, supply chain for solar. Let's come back to that in the resource options and technologies availability question. Great.
Okay.
And Anastasia, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Margie, I just wanted to thank you for, yes, and Mr. Fishman, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. That's something in our later presentation when we talk about resource options and technologies. We'll go into more detail about those different resources, but that was a good question.
Appreciate it.
And last question, Anastasia, do you have a short one?
Yeah, I do. This is a quick follow-up, and I think probably the last interjection may have answered. I'm sorry, I don't have the right. I'm going to just turn the video off because this is horrible. So as far what Kara asked about batteries, she was talking about the kind of small scale. Could you just give us a very, very, very quick description of how utility scale battery capacity is being worked into the forecasting? I just don't know what assumptions you're making as to the usage, the availability, those kinds of very, very, very high level. I'd appreciate.
I can toss that to Ben. I don't know, Ben, you want to take that now or as you address it in your section here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let's quickly address that now. So when we look at utility scale energy storage, That is not included in the load forecast. Instead, the way we treat utility scale energy storage is we have it as a resource that's available for selection within the capacity expansion model. And that resource essentially increases load. You need to have other generating resources to charge the storage. And then the storage can obviously discharge at other times. So it's not a direct component of the load forecast. Instead, it's a technology that allows EPE to shift load from different times and also different times, in different moments when resources cost different, different cost forecasts for megawatt hour to charge a resource versus discharge a resource. So, and I'm sorry, that was a terrible explanation. So let me start that one more time. So just to confirm, the energy storage resource is not included in the load forecast. They are treated as a resource within the model. And the model can look at when's the optimal time economically and from a system reliability purpose to charge the storage resource, and also from an economic and a reliability optimal dispatch signal for when to discharge the resource. So hopefully that makes sense. And apologies for the terrible first description. Hopefully the second one's clearer.
Well, I will say from the first description, you made a frightening statement, I think, about you treat it as a load, and I understand it's a load, but I hope that when all the planning is done, that it's treated as an off hour, a beneficial load as opposed to a contributor to peak periods. But I'm sure we'll get into that later, but that's really kind of my concern as we go forward, that we learn how that sort of, the pattern of charging and discharging, how that just floats alongside with the other load and resource decisions.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so just to clarify, the storage is treated as both a load and a resource within the modeling.
Great. Thank you. Thanks
And
for the
timing
question.
and everything, correct?
We're gonna go on, Anastasia. Thanks. That maybe more dialogue offline would be appropriate. We're gonna move to the second presentation, which is planning reserve margin and capacity accreditation. So again, please jot down your questions, and at the end of the 20 minutes, we'll have you raise hands and ask questions again. If there's something that remains a question from this first presentation that you did not get a chance to ask, you're free to bring that up at the final question and answer period or put it into chat. So keep track of your questions, and back to you, EPE team.
Yeah, so.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Nate. I was just gonna take a moment to remind everyone that we have retained E3 to help us go through the IRP process, the modeling process. And as such, I wanted to introduce Ben Elsey and Nate Lee. So take it away, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Emmanuel. And thanks everyone for joining our stakeholder meeting. My name is Nathan Lee, and I'm here with my colleague Ben Elsey. We are with E3. I'm a senior managing consultant in E3, and both of us sit within the integrated system planning practice here. And we've been working with EPE for a number of years to support their IRP and other kind of planning activities. So I'm happy to be here supporting EPE and part of the stakeholder process. Wanted to talk a little bit about our planning reserve margin and what this means in terms of the ISP and how EPE is doing their planning. So first off, as Emmanuel said, EPE retained our team to support a number of modeling activities here in the ISP. And one of those is the loss of load probability study, or LOLP, you might hear. And this is simply an analysis that's meant to determine EPE's planning reserve margin, or you may hear PRM requirement. So kind of the amount of megawatts they need to hold to ensure resource adequacy, as well as the effective load carrying capacities for different resources, both their existing, planned, and potential candidate future resources. And by resources, I mean, our generation resources like solar, wind, thermal, etc. The idea here is that loss of load probability, or this analysis kind of represents the probability that any of the available generation capacity on EPE's system will be insufficient to meet the system load at any given time. So the idea here is just to understand kind of what is the probability that load may not be met by the existing planned resource or candidate resources at any moment in time, so that we can make sure that they have enough resources online to ensure resource adequacy. Next slide. Okay. So want to step into kind of the planning reserve margin, or PRM, as well. So this planning reserve margin is essentially quantifying the amount of that additional capacity that EPE needs to hold on their system to ensure that they're maintaining their system reliability, right? They want to make sure that all of their customers have, that reliable source of electricity at all times, right? So utilities typically carry this planning reserve as a contingency to ensure, the reliable services at all times, like I just noted, keeping your lights on, keeping your computers running at work, et cetera. Even during times of, unforeseen circumstances, the load might exceed what, for example, we just saw in the last presentation, what was forecast, right? Or there may be some unexpected outages, a generator trip or transmission line trip. And so we want to make sure that we're carrying enough resources to ensure adequacy at all times. Historically, this PRM also kind of captured some of the unreliability or just outages that could potentially occur in generation. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that's more and more so being incorporated into what I talked about as the ELCC, or that effective load carrying capacity. Whereas, variations in demand, may require additional capacity, and that's kind of what we're looking for with a PRM. So the PRM really represents kind of that minimum amount of additional or just resource capacity beyond EPE's peak demands throughout a year that they need to maintain to ensure that resource adequacy. And it's typically expressed as kind of a percentage of a coincident system peak demand, or in EPE's case, maybe just their system peak demand. So currently, EPE's PRM requirement is expected to increase from 9% through 2029 to 11% in 2030 to just kind of reflect their reliability requirements. If we want to think about this in just really simple numbers, let's say that EPE's system peak demand was only 100 megawatts. It is not, and you had to have a 10% PRM requirement. That would be an extra 10 megawatts on that 100 megawatts that they would have to hold to make sure that they are meeting that PRM target. So that's what we mean by expressed as a percentage of the peak demand, and it's carried above the peak load forecast. Great. Moving forward, I guess we've kind of talked about the loss of load probability study, our planning reserve margin, and how that ensures our resource adequacy. But I did want to just maybe touch on the fact that planning for this resource adequacy and reliability, which EPE is doing as part of the their IRP process, is increasing in complexity. A few points I just want to highlight here. As we transition, I've heard some great questions from stakeholders here about solar resources, storage, right? These are becoming more common resources that we're using on the grid as we move towards, whatever goals or technology advancements we have. But this transition towards the renewables and storages also introduces some new sources of complexity. So for example, planning exclusively for a peak demand really becomes obsolete, as a lot of these resources can help to shift when that actual peak may be occurring. And we need to think about it a little differently. Frameworks for resource adequacy need to be modernized to consider conditions, across all hours of the year. So looking across your entire year and not just, your peak day or your peak load in some instance. So flagging that. Additionally, reliability and reliable electricity supply is really becoming, front and center and a very hot button topic, right? We want to make sure that we're always reliable, and when we aren't reliable, it has significant, cost impacts, but also, human impacts. So we need to make sure we're not, having those significant impacts. We're looking on the right here, at the top, a potential shortfall in electricity during a heat wave in California, which is, possibly gained a lot of attention across the US. And at the bottom, for Texas, maybe closer to New Mexico here, frigid temperatures in a recent storm, devastating kind of the Texas power grid by taking resources out and leaving unmet demand. So just flagging, that this is becoming more complex, but also is becoming more of headline news as well. So next. So as we're seeing, this transition in terms of resources and this complexity in resource adequacy planning, we're also seeing kind of the capacity need and resource capacity contributions of these towards the peak increasingly being shaped by what portfolio of resources we have on the system. So here I'm showing kind of on the left what I would, in quotes, call a conventional system, because this is maybe not conventional anymore. And then moving to the right, where I'm showing kind of more of a modern, or to what today's kind of system planning looks like. So if we start on the left with just the conventional system, we can see this gray kind of curve there with a black line on top. And this is meant to represent our total load on our system and operating reserves. And this is just an illustrative example. And you can see that conventionally, the need for resources is kind of defined by the peak in that curve on the, that we see here. So the total reliability need is essentially just that peak demand at that instance. And then, depending on how wide that peak is, and this is shown here with this horizontal arrow, you may have some loss of load planning hours or some hours where you're at risk for not meeting load. So in this framework, capacity is typically accredited. So capacity mean your thermal plants, et cetera, are accredited based on their nameplate capacity. So if you have a 100 megawatt plant, then maybe you assume that's 100 megawatts of accredited capacity. And that capacity accreditation is really independent of the portfolio, meaning no matter what other resources you have on there, we always just assume nameplate capacity at each resource. And what we do is we typically sum all of these up, and we would just make sure that we're meeting that peak. So if you look here, we go from the curve that shows our total reliability need to this kind of bar that just shows that same kind of amount of capacity for total reliability need. And then we just make sure that we can stack up all of our accredited capacity to meet that reliability need. So if our reliability need was 200 megawatts, for example, and we had two 100 megawatt thermal plants that added up to 200, that may be, our conventional system kind of accreditation. As we move to the right now, I want to highlight some differences in the figure at the bottom. So that gray curve, now you can see has some complexity to it, I would say. So the total load and operating resources at the top is still the same if we look across the two figures. But a good portion of that load is being met by our renewables. And those, may not be consistently available, right? They're variable, they're intermittent, but we want to use them, right? They're low cost and energy options. So once we account for the renewables, under that, you can see that there is a gray figure still that needs to be met by other resources that are not renewables. And we call this kind of the net load. And you can see here that our peak is no longer at that really high load period because we are able to meet some of that through our renewables. Our peak has actually shifted a little bit, and we have these new loss of load planning hours, or this new peak that's kind of shifted out further to the right. And we can see that we can meet some of that potentially with storage, but it is not at that same hour. So we cannot just look at our peak load in each year and plan to that, right? But we need to think about the resource portfolio. So our need now is based on, if you let me call it the net peak. And the capacity is actually accredited based on what we introduced earlier, this effective load carrying capacity, or ELCC, which means, how much we can count on a resource type during those peak hours, which may shift as we introduce this new portfolio. So that now capacity accreditation is also dependent on the resource portfolio. So if we look here, we look to the right of this curve, and we see this marginal reliability need, meaning we don't need to meet that whole peak demand. We just need to meet this kind of marginal need over the net peak. And then we account for resources contribution to that net peak, kind of using their ELCCs, or how effective they are at meeting that peak in that hour. And that, again, we determine through our loss of load planning and our ELCC estimates. So then we can stack those up and be sure that we are reliable. Next slide. Great. So what is ELCC? I think hopefully from these last slides, you got a glimpse of what it means for our planning. But essentially, it is our effective load carrying capability, which measures, our resources' reliable capacity during the periods, or those net peak periods, when the grid is most likely to expect electricity shortfalls or potential loss of load events. ELCCs are expressed as, a share of the resource's total installed capacity, with higher percentages really reflecting more consistently available resources, right? So if our ELCC is, close to 100%, that's just meaning that it overlaps very well or corresponds very well with our net peak, or where we expect to see those shortfalls. If it's really low, that means that it may not be so available or dispatchable during those hours. ELCCs are really important as we incorporate more of this variable intermittent renewables, as you saw, just to understand kind of what those mean in terms of reliable capacity and how they can contribute to EPE's system needs. ELCCs really allow EPE to better understand the amount of capacity that can be delivered and plan effectively in utilizing its existing plan portfolio, but also choosing, future resources to add to their system. Great. So here I just wanted to give you kind of a little taste of what ELCCs look like for different resources, so you kind of understand what we mean here. But I also want to just introduce some terminology, or some might say some jargon, that you might hear from others in the planning world and this IRP process. So no resource is perfect, and ELCCs can and should be applied to all resources, is the title here, meaning that some resources we refer to as firm capacity, or you might hear dispatchable, you might hear reliable. I'm not sure. There's lots of terms out there, but these are all really essentially, variations of, an ELCC that is just, or resource that has an ELCC that's just essentially 100% available, or very close to 100% available, right? We can count on it, and we can turn it on and off when we need it. So just flagging that, and that ELCCs allow us to kind of level the playing field of this. So not just our dispatchable resources, but also to assign a similar kind of assumption towards our variable or intermittent resources. So it can, account for our hourly variability, or duration and or use limitations, right? Maybe we just can't use it during certain times of the day or year. Seasonal temperature derates, right? Sometimes thermal needs a certain temperature outside to, operate at full capacity for cooling. Seasonal energy availability, fuel availabilities, temperature-related outage rates, and then just kind of other outage risks and extreme condition kind of impacts. So the idea of the ELCC is just to try and reflect across all resource types how reliable they may, how callable they might be, in certain hours that we need them at net peak load. So what we use is kind of this perfect capacity or PCAP accounting, as opposed to kind of historic approaches where we just assume the installed capacity or similar kind of allocation. So on the right here, just kind of showing, wind and solar at the top, kind of shading in these boxes with kind of an estimate of where we see their ELCC values being. So, wind and solar, they're variable, they're intermittent, they have lower ELCC values. And as we go down, we see these resources become more dispatchable or quote, more firm, such as our thermal natural gas down below. On this slide, I'm also going to flag real quick that this is different. So when we talk about firm capacity and dispatchable capacity and effective load carrying capacity, we're talking about, your PRM and the resource adequacy. You may also hear capacity factor mentioned. And capacity factor is more of a measure of just the overall availability of that resource throughout the year, but not specifically, its ability to meet a reliability or resource adequacy requirement. Great.
So Nate, you've got about a minute and a half left. If you want to try to wrap your key points, that'd be great.
Yeah, sorry, my timer had 2 minutes left. Real quick, E3's kind of loss of load planning model, which, we build these ELCCs and PRMs with, is shown here. We'll share these slides, but essentially we input kind of our load, our resource types, and a lot of our assumptions about their operation. And what we get out is essentially kind of those topics we just discussed are, total reliability need, potential ELCCs for different resources, and the hours that we might have unserved energy. So it helps us to answer some of these kind of resource adequacy related questions. Next slide. Yeah, so we can skip this and I'll come back to it at another time if there's questions. We can skip kind of the resource strategy key questions here. Or we can go back. I can talk through some of these. Here, I just want to flag one more slide there. Here, I just want to flag, with this study and our PRM, what we're really looking for is making sure that EPE system is reliable and adequate, right? What is the total effective or accredited capacity that the system needs to ensure reliability at all hours and their reliability standard? And then how can different resources that may not be, firm, like our thermal, contribute to the total capacity requirement? And then how does the reliability contribution of some of these intermittent limited duration resources change, as the portfolio on EPE system changes? So then finally, this helps us understand as EPE is trading off different resources to meet their load, which ones offer reliability versus, low cost energy, and which ones are economic to making sure that they're reliable over the, the horizon. So I'll end there if there's any questions.
Great, thanks, Nate. Please raise your hand if you have questions for Nate. While you're doing that, Nate, let me take the prerogative, ask the first question. Where do the numbers for planning reserve margin and ELCC come from? What are the sources of those two sets of numbers, please?
Sorry, Mark, did you mind just repeating that one? Sorry, I was looking at a different question in the chat.
Yes, the 9% and 11% requirement for planning reserve margin. Where does that come from? What is the source of that set of numbers? And where do the ELCC numbers come from? What are the sources of those numbers?
Yeah, so maybe if we jump back to maybe 3 slides ago, or if you just go back to here, this is actually fine. Next slide. Oh no, previous slide, sorry. There's a delay on my previous slide. Previous slide. Where's the, there's a picture of our loss of load planning model, and I can't see it, maybe because of the delay. Apologies. Here, there we are. Yeah, so high level answer to this question is that the PRM and the ELCC values come out of a loss of load planning analysis or probability analysis. So what we do is we essentially put in, their load, and we put in the load for a number of different potential years. So, thousands of different weather years of what load could look like. And then we put in their resources and some of the assumptions around their availability to understand what their potential planning reserve requirement would be in order to meet their system reliability targets, which, as you said, the PRM is 9 going up to 11, but the EPE system has a loss of load probability target, of I think it's 0.1 starting in 2030. So we're essentially tuning the model and their system to make sure that they have that loss of load probability or less in all years. So essentially EPE is transitioning from a 0.2 to a 0.1, and that's why we see the change in the PRM. Additionally here, we can calculate the ELCCs with the loss of load probability modeling by understanding kind of how they can contribute in those net peak hours and determining their ELCC through loss of load planning modeling.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Nate. Other hands raised at this point.
Margie, if I might interject,
Yep,
this is
Kathy.
Kathy Boyce. I'm kind of keeping tabs on the chat here. If we could go back on, while we're talking about ELCCs, if we could go back to slide 26. We have a question in the chat about the ELCC applied to all resources. Is it really applied to all, or is EPE using forced outage rate method for thermal resources? And then there's a second one, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, I can go ahead and take that one. Cynthia, good to speak to you again. It's been a while. Just to clarify, E3 did apply ELCC for all resource types, including thermal generation. So we did not use the forced outage rate that the SPP used, ELC for all resources. And then to Cynthia's,
I'll add some more.
Ben, hi, it's good to hear from you. And so that is a advancement then in the process, isn't it? The E3 and the IRP process from, say, where we were with PNM and then SPS. So you actually did a all resources ELCC analysis?
Yeah, so I can't speak to PNM, but simply, as you know, obviously I can speak to SPS here. And SPS are driven by the Southwest Power Pool's requirements. In the SPP determined that renewables and storage use ELCC, and thermal generation uses, as you point out, the forced outage rate methodology. So yes, E3, we consider this to be a more sophisticated and a more advanced approach to resource accreditation.
Okay, so not now, Ben, but in the future, as we go through the process, staff at least, and I think others, some of us would like to understand from you and E3 just how you see that, or see that changing the ELCCs on a relative basis from the prior, say, IRP, or whether we could just have that discussion, particularly in regard to the forced outage rates on thermals.
That'd be a great
absolutely.
topic for workshop number 3, when we talk modeling details. Yep.
And then I'll go ahead and address Cynthia's second part of our question here in the chat. And that was, did E3 calculate ELCCs for combined wind and solar combined with storage? So to answer your question there, Cynthia, that's a yes and a no answer. So for wind, we did not calculate wind and storage ELCs combined, just because there's not a very strong correlation between their reliability contributions.
Okay.
However, there is a correlated increase in reliability contributions of solar and storage. In other words, the sum of the parts is less than the total value when you look at solar and storage. So we did do a combined ELCC for solar with storage.
Okay, and then Ben, that is an advancement from the 2021 EPE IRP, isn't it?
I can't speak to that, unfortunately. Nate, do you know the answer?
I believe that we were using a solar storage surface previously in EPE's model and a wind curve, but we can confirm that if
Okay,
necessary.
I didn't see it in the plan. I reviewed the plan. So, thank you.
So
Thank you.
Kathy, anything else you want to bring to attention? Otherwise, I don't see any other hands up. So I'm proposing we go to a short break unless you see something.
Just to compliment from Chris Leger, appreciate using the ELCC for all the resources and including the correlated risk. So thank you for that modeling advancement.
So Margie, this is Judy. Just going back to Cynthia Mitchell's comment on an advancement from the 2021 IRP. And Margie, your comment was correct. Yes. In the third workshop, which we will be hosting in 2 weeks, which is a hybrid workshop, we will go into more detail, not just about the action plan, but we will also talk about EPE's 2021 action plan, and more details there and how that relates to the modeling and the actions going forward.
Great, thanks, Judy. All right, we're just a bit behind schedule. I show it's 2:19. Let's take a 10-minute break, returning at 2:30 to reconvene on the next two presentations. So thank you. I'll take a stretch break. We'll be back in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. As the EPE3 team is getting set up for the next two presentations, let me apologize for failing to introduce my colleagues from GridWorks who are here supporting the workshop today. Got Kathy Boys, our Director of the Interior West, here, and Deborah Shields, our project administrator, both diligently working behind the scenes. Thanks them both for being here as well. So Judy, back over to you all for the resource options and technologies portion of the workshop. Again, stakeholders, please keep track of your questions. We're going to ask you to raise your hand and state your questions verbally when we get to the end of this particular presentation. We'll do the same thing with the fourth presentation, and we're hoping to have some time at the end for general other questions, but please be prepared to come off mute at the end of this session by raising your hand, and we'll call on you for questions. That's the mechanism we prefer at this point for question and answers. So over to you, Judy, Manuel, Ben, Nathan, team.
Margie, and just right before we jump into the next presentation on resource options and technologies, which will be given by Emmanuel, there was a quick question that came up, 2 seconds, and we just want to make a really quick clarification.
Yes, and this is in reference to the question asked about charging for EV buses. The correction is it's 450 kilowatts, not megawatts.
Great. Thank you for chasing that down. And Alan, hopefully that addresses your question, and thank you for that clarification.
Thank you for catching that typo, Mr. Downs. We appreciate it. So we can go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking right now, again, same story. We're going to be trying to increase everybody's base knowledge of EP system. And we're going to start here. We presented this last time in the first stakeholder meeting. We're bringing it back here and just going to dive into more detail. So this is a listing of EPE's conventional generation. We can start off with the different plants that we have across our territory. First is our Rio Grande plant, which is in New Mexico. We have our Newman power plant, which is in Northeast El Paso. You can see a small line item there for copper. That is a peaking unit that we have in Central El Paso. And then our Montana power station, that's far east El Paso. And then our Palo Verde nuclear ownership state, that is in Arizona. Our Rio Grande plant was made up of units 6, 7, 8, and 9. 6 and 7 have been retired, are now in inactive reserve. Unit 8 is a conventional steamer, planned retirement of 2033. Rio Grande 9 is a CT. Some quick background there. The difference between the different technology types there. A conventional steamer, think about it as, again, conventional, a heat source, creating steam, pushing it through the turbine, creating electricity. A combustion turbine, you can think of it more as just a giant engine, a fuel source combusted, turning a generator. Where you see the 2x1 CC, that's a 2-on-1 combined cycle. What that means is there are 2 combustion turbines, and their exhaust is then used to create steam to power a steamer, a third generator. So that's the 2-on-1 convention. Something that we want to point out here is the different types of generation. So there is base load generation, there is intermediate generation, and then there's peak load. Your base load generation is the generation that you use to provide continuous steady power. That's the generators that are run 24/7 for months and months at a time. The reason that they're run like that is because that's where they run at their most efficient, and they have slower ramp up and ramp down times, meaning these are not the type of generation that you can turn off one day and bring on the next day. So they typically only come off for scheduled maintenances and things of that sort. You then have the next layer of generation, which is your intermediate generation. So this one is more flexible. It can adjust its output to daily fluctuations in your demand. It is able to be brought up in a relatively short amount of time. That is more the example of the CTs, whereas the base load generation is more like the nuclear and the conventional steamers. Then you also have your peak generation, your peaking load generation. These are more quick start units that can come online and then have full output in, I believe it's something like 10 minutes. And this is why I'm glad I have Dave Hawkins in the room with me, so you can correct me wherever I'm misstating something. So your peak load generation is something that can be brought on every day or even multiple times a day, depending on the facility or the generator. And it's used to meet that peak demand, or it can be brought on in terms in an emergency situation. Some examples of that would be your Rio Grande 9 CT is a quick start. The 4 units at Montana are quick starts, and then the newest addition to our fleet, Newman 6, which is a sizable unit, is also a quick start unit. We can go on to the next slide. So here, this is again, listing of our resources, but this is everything that we have in our renewable portfolios. So something I want to point out here, I mean, we can go through the list, but something I really want to highlight is EPE's been steadily adding solar to its portfolio since 2008. So we're pretty happy about that, pretty proud of that fact that we've been doing this for a while. We can also point out here that we have a lot of solar on our system. We are called the Sun City for a reason. It is, I think the sun shines something north of 330 days a year here, something ridiculous like that. So there you have it. For here, we can talk about these resources really become more important when you're talking about your RPS, your renewable portfolio standard. We do this filing once a year. I believe the filing is on May 1st. It's done on a 2-year basis, one where we're looking at the planning year, and then the subsequent year after that, planning year +1, where it's more informational. But these are the resources that are currently being used towards meeting our RPS. Go to the next slide. So here is all of the planned resources that EP has coming online that have been as a result of the last RFPs that have been issued by the company. Something interesting to point out here is you'll notice the nameplate capacity of the facilities of the planned additions in contrast to those from the previous slide. It's just emblematic of how quickly our load is growing and then how cost-effective utility scale solar is becoming. Something else I would want to point out here is that you'll notice that the fuel type, where on the previous ones were all solar. I think there was only 1 or 2 on the previous page that said solar and battery. Here you can see that our modeling efforts, our models are kicking out more solar and battery picks as we're doing our resource procurement. That's just more emblematic of how important battery storage is becoming relative to solar. That hits on or builds on Ben's earlier point about some of their parts. They're very complementary, solar and battery, and you can see that as it's being picked more and more by our models. Also, what you can point out here is all of the unnamed facilities after Carne Felina Milagro, the ones going down. Those are all a result of the 2023 RFP, and all of those are currently in contract negotiations. And we hope to have those executed or finished executing in the next couple of months here, but we're really excited about all of the solar and battery that we have coming onto our system. Again, it's just, as we're moving forward with our decarbonization and increasing our renewable footprint, we're really excited about everything that's to come. On this slide here, what we want to point out is the potential resources or the potential resource options that we have or that we will be considering as part of the IRP plus. So the first of which are your intermittent resources. That's your typical, your solar and your wind. Intermittent resources because, as you know, the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day, the wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. You do have cloud coverage and things like that. These are intermittent resources. They all these different resources have their place in your portfolio and their position in your resource stack. The solar and wind here create that intermittency in your system, which then can be filled in by your other firm resources or your supply side resources. So your firm resources here, you're looking at your more typical geothermal, your 4 and 8 hour battery storage systems, your gas combustion turbines, CTs, like what we just described in the previous slides, and your combined cycle gas CCs. I want to point out that the resources with the green leaves here are all your clean energy resources that are being considered. Aside from the demand side, here you have your supply side alternatives. Those are going to be your distributed energy resources, your DERs, akin to your virtual power plants. You have demand response programs, load management, energy efficiency. Your imports there, that's your wholesale power trading. The other portion that we're going to talk about here, or we want to mention, if you recall in the first part of the presentation where we were talking about the different time horizons, your intermediate, your midterm, your long-term, the emerging resources to be explored, this is what falls under there for your long-term planning. It's the technology that we need to keep an eye on as the technology becomes less of a thought experiment or less of when it starts to get deployed at scale. That's where you really start to see it involved or incorporated into your modeling. And that's what we're doing here. We're trying to keep these long duration energy storage systems. So these are your 10+ hour batteries. For your gas firm resources, these are going to be with an alternative hydrogen fuel source or carbon capture technology. And then you have your modular nuclear systems that also seem to be picking up speed. Oh, thank you, Marty. Next slide. So this here is really just an informational slide. I think at this point we all have a somewhat solid understanding on what we mean by a solar facility. It's a photovoltaic system, converts sunlight into electricity. This is an example of one right here. What I want to point out here is based off of the presentation earlier from Ben and Nate, you could see the capacity factor of your average solar facility is between 30 and 35%. And also another important item to point out here is as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act from 2022, your solar PV systems are eligible for the ITC and PTC. So your incentive tax credits and your production tax credits, investment tax credits and production tax credits. So typo there. So here, similar, this is your standard battery energy storage system. What's cool about here is that the batteries provide firm dispatchable capacity. So you're not limited anymore to what your conventional generation was in terms of a dispatchable resource. The really cool opportunities here with the battery storage systems is the ability to also use them to create more efficiencies in the system where you can charge them up when energy prices are low and then dispatch them at times where energy prices are high. So overall lowering the cost of your overall portfolio. So that's a really cool benefit that we're looking at. And they are currently eligible for investment tax credits as well. Here on the resource, considering the resource technology, you have your wind turbines. Anybody who's ever driven through Arizona, New Mexico, parts of California, you'll see those things everywhere. They are gigantic. They're 3-blade fans. We currently don't have any wind on our system. We're hoping that that does change. Your average wind capacity factor there can range between 40 to 55%. And they are currently eligible for production and investment tax credits as well. Here, this is what we had talked about. This is a combustion turbine up on the screen. Like I mentioned, it takes your combustible resource, your fuel, in this case, natural gas, and then turns it into electricity. And your capacity factor here for a generator of this size is about 5 to 60%. That would be different from your base load conventional generation where the capacity factors can reach north of 70, 80%. And just going back to the earlier comment on the nuclear base load generation, that capacity factor is upper 90s. So you can see everything has its place in your resource stack. Geothermal, another one that we do not have in our service territory right now, but we are hopeful. There seems to be some initiatives about geothermal in the region, so we're keeping an eye on that. Again, always trying to keep an eye on emerging technology or adding more variability to our resource stack. So geothermal, it converts underground heat using water and steam to spin a turbine, create electricity. The capacity factor for geothermal can actually be surprisingly high, so between 90 to 95%. I think that does depend on the different type of geothermal, but more of that to come later, and it is currently eligible for an investment tax credit. Here we're going to be just hitting a little more on your load management and demand response programs. I think really the most important takeaway here is going to be the ability for the utility to engage and enroll customers and get people comfortable with new programs as they roll out, and making sure that these get out into the public and people can see what is being offered. I think your typical limitation when it comes to load management or demand response programs is that they're typically limited to certain times of day or a certain number of times that the utility can call on the resource. So it's limited in your number of occurrences or the frequency. And this is just a overall summary of what we think our future, or we hope our future resource portfolio could include. We are still hoping to integrate more renewable and storage resources. We are keeping an eye out as renewable penetration increases. Again, we are hoping to use battery storage to shift our load from low load periods to high load periods, and then take advantage of the economics there where we can charge at low cost times and discharge at high cost times. And overall, just creating the most cost effective dispatchable portfolio that we have, or dispatch of generation. And I believe that is it on this one. Questions?
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. Let's see. We've got a question from Alan. Please go ahead, Alan.
I wanted to, excuse me, ask a question on slide 38, which is the thermal resources. You seem to be specifically describing gas turbines, but I think of thermal resources as gas generators or nuclear generators. And I'm curious why the capacity factor is as low as 60% maximum. I would have expected somewhere in the 90s.
You are right. The 5 to 60% here is because the image is of a small scale CT peaking unit. So you're not gonna have a peaking unit running 24/7 where that capacity factor is gonna be in the upper 90s. Yes, you're right. We should change this title, or we can add to it, because yes, you're right, that for thermal resources, you would see something like nuclear, and you will see those capacity factors in the upper 90s that you're describing. So we can make those corrections and be a little more specific here.
Also, it sounds like you're defining capacity factor a little bit differently than I expected. I thought capacity factor was what the device was capable of. And for thermal, it's usually just if it breaks down, that it's not available. Whereas you seem to be using capacity factor as how it is actually used on the system.
So, Mr. Downs, hi, Dave Hawkins here. Good to see you again. You're right. Capacity factor actually probably describes the usage of it versus its capability. For some of our base loaded resources, they're going to go up and down as our load goes up and down. So off peak, they'll be backed off probably to about 30% of their capability. On peak hours, depending how many resources we're running, you'll get a much higher output. All of those factor into the capacity factor. Nuclear, as you mentioned, it's pretty much base loaded at its maximum output the whole time. And so you will see those higher capacity factors associated with it. So I think usage versus peak capability, capacity factor is more representative of the usage.
Yeah, and maybe just to piggyback on there, Alan, what you're describing, we usually typically refer to as availability factor. So that's just another term. Yeah, we usually refer to kind of its maximum capability over a period of time as its availability factor.
Okay, so on the previous two slides where you're talking, or three slides, several slides back, where we're talking about wind and, well, I don't see the solar one. Wind is 37. And there, by capacity factor, I assume you mean when the wind blows, when it is available, rather than how you use it.
Yeah, for renewable resources, capacity factor and availability factor are almost one and the same. And when you talk about thermal resources, availability factor is the time it's available over the year if it was to be called upon. And to Dave's point there, capacity factor is its usage during that period.
Thank you. I appreciate the explanation.
Great. Thank you. And let's go to Steve had a lingering question about supply chain for solar. Steve, let's have them. I don't know if you have a different question, but your prerogative as to what to ask at this point. Steve,
well, let's start with the solar supply chain, and then I have one other question after that. Short one.
Ben, I'll take first shot, and if you have other information. So as we're seeing larger scale utility applications for solar, there is supply chain issues, more so related at this point to interconnecting to the transmission system, whether it's transformers or breakers. The higher voltage equipment needed for larger scale, we're seeing about a 4-year timeline on some of this materials. And so, it depends if suppliers, if they have their own slots for this type of equipment, if they can bring them in sooner. But when we give an estimate for the interconnection of some of this new equipment that needs to be ordered, that's typically the timeline we're seeing.
Okay. And you don't see any problems with the panels themselves?
The panels at this point, I would say in E3, if you're seeing something different, are not the critical piece of equipment in the timeline. It's the transmission interconnection equipment.
Okay. Then my other question had to do with slide 34. And it had, I think did I do the right one there? Yeah. So under firm resources, it's got battery, 4 and 8 hour lithium ion. I was wondering if it was intentional to exclude other emerging battery technologies.
No, it
So
was.
I can,
Go ahead.
do you want me to take that one, Emmanuel?
Yes.
So, Mr. Fishman, just to be clear, the resources listed across the top are kind of existing commercially available resources, which traditionally in the storage space is lithium-ion storage.
Yeah.
But if you kind of focus to the bottom of the page, we have emerging resources to be explored. And down there, you see long duration energy storage. So that's where we want to capture some of those flow batteries, some of those additional chemistries that are going to give you multi-day storage solutions.
Okay. You don't see those applying to shorter term batteries?
At the moment, typically what you're going to see if EPE were to issue a competitive RFP right now is 99.9% of those bids that come in are going to be lithium-ion 4 to 8 hour storage resources.
Okay, but you're open to other technologies once they're proven reliable.
Absolutely.
Correct. And I think, those emerging technologies can be explored as sensitivities within the analyses.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Fishman, if you don't mind me just adding to the earlier response, I just want to be very clear when we talk about supply chain issues, that certainly applies to solar resources and the main power transformers, but it's also true for other technologies. Wind uses the same main power transformers. Gas uses their own generated step-up unit transformers. There's huge supply chain issues across the board. It's not just a solar issue.
Solar. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the last question on this topic, and then we'll move to the fourth presentation, is Don Kurtz. Don, please go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to ask on the land management, load management and demand response item. I might have missed it. I didn't see time of use rates as a resource. And I just wondered, does that occur somewhere else or we're not thinking about that right now?
It is something that is being considered and looked at. Not being on the list here is just carelessness on my part.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Let's see. It's last question, Kara, go ahead, and then we'll shift to the last presentation.
Okay. I have two quick questions. The first is, in the Texas PUC, I've seen some supply chain issues related to natural gas supplies. I was wondering if EPE has seen any of that. And then second of all, do the RFPs that you will issue include the opportunity for scrutiny of whether certain equipment, and we've been talking about solar equipment, can be supplied sooner or later?
So let me just interject, Kara. The question on RFPs will be relevant at the end of this process. I don't think we're there yet, but your first question on natural gas availability, EP, you want to address that one?
Well, it was more like supply chain related issues, not availability.
Okay, supply chain of natural gas. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thank you. Sorry.
Our latest natural gas project, our Newman 6-1, came commercial at the end of 2023, I believe, as a Texas resource. I think there were some supply chain issues associated with certain components to bring that online. But the schedule of that resource wasn't what we saw, say, during COVID, when there was issues with vendors who couldn't report to work and work on turbine blades and those type of things. So I think COVID presented its own unique set of supply chain issues with maintenance associated with natural gas plants. but I think there were smaller components that had some impact on our Newman 6 commercial operation date. I don't know if that, I just want to point out in our latest RFP that we did for 2023, for both Texas and New Mexico, we did not select any natural gas generation. So it's not an issue that we're having to look at currently.
Great, thank you.
Margie,
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you're keen. I know you're keen to move on, but we've just had a couple of questions on a real critical part of the statement of need. And if I could just take just 2 minutes to go to slide 9.
Yeah.
And Emmanuel touched upon this earlier, and I just want to reiterate this. As we are filing the IRP and looking at the statement of need, there are supply chain issues just across the board right now. It takes longer to build generation and longer to build transmission than it has done in a number of years. So as EP are pulling together this statement of need, and if you look at kind of that middle box there, the 3 to 10 years, historically, utilities could file an IRP and bring new resources online within 3 or 4 years. That time period has got longer. So it's really important for EP and other utilities to be proactive in their resource planning. So as we look at this statement of need, I'm very, very encouraging here for stakeholders to look at that 10-year window. So EP can identify what resources they need to be bringing online in the next 10 years so they can start procuring and planning for these resources today. We can't live in a reactive world anymore where you just assume you could bring resources on at the drop of a hat. So that's true to solar, it's true to wind, it's true to natural gas.
Great, thanks, Ben. That's a good reminder. That's why we're having this conversation and why at the next workshop, we will ask EPE to give the whole group an update on what's going on with actions that came out of the prior IRP. So we'll come back to that, but for now, let's go to learn some more about capacity expansion modeling. Back to you, EPE 3 team.
This section of the presentation, we're going to kick over to Ben and Nate. Sorry, you guys are mute.
We technical difficulties here. We're off muted now, ready to go. Thanks, Emmanuel. Yeah, happy to jump back into kind of some of our modeling activities. Specifically here, EPE will be exploring kind of their future resource addition options and portfolios through what we call capacity expansion modeling. And essentially, capacity expansion modeling is a resource optimization or resource portfolio optimization activity that is meant to identify that least cost, kind of long term. We're talking about the horizon of the IRP, combination of generation and transmission investments that they need, subject to kind of those constraints that the EPE is facing. Their reliability constraints, policy, and then the technical or operational kind of constraints of the different resources that they're considering. So as discussed previously, capacity expansion modeling is really considering a set of candidate resources such as wind, solar, thermal, and demand side activities such as electric vehicle demand response, as well as transmission expansion options to kind of meet these requirements. There is a term here called Plexos LT, and this is just the modeling software package that we will be using for capacity expansion modeling. There are lots of options on the table out there. Plexos LT is one that EPE and E3 are very experienced with, and comes from kind of a reputable, widely accepted, or widely used toolkit from Energy Exemplar. So it's essentially a capacity expansion modeling tool. LT just means long term. Next slide. Great. So capacity expansion planning, what are those key questions that this actually helps us answer for an IRP? So first I wanted to just talk over, kind of the questions and then kind of give you a visual aid to what we're describing here. So essentially this helps us, as I described, identify that least cost resource portfolio that meets their reliability needs while also meeting kind of the reliability targets. For example, in New Mexico, RPS or REA requirements. What are the optimal resources added to the system over the horizon? So like, what are those optimal resources both on the generation, and now we're talking about ISP, so we're including, some potential transmission expansion to be done, simultaneously with our generation expansion. How can EPE really meet the New Mexico Energy Transition Act requirements most cost effectively for their territory? And what is the role of some of the firm or, like we described before, dispatchable generation capacity in ensuring resource adequacy, as well as, some of these variable intermittent resources. So those are the questions that it helps us answer and many more. But on the right, you can see this nice figure. And it's important to kind of understand some terms here. And first off, with continued load growth on EPE's system, as Anadina described previously, we will need more resources to meet our load requirements. So on the right here, you can see kind of, as an illustrative figure, our load increasing. So this dotted gray line from 2025 out through the horizon 2050. But on top of that, as we described in our previous section, we need to hold, a planning reserve margin over that to ensure resource adequacy. So that is also, an additional, increasing over the horizon over our load. Within this, we also have kind of our baseline resources or baseline kind of accredited existing planned resources, which are assumed to remain in service throughout the horizon, also reflecting the retirement dates. So you can see the black here in this figure that, in the near term, we may be adding some kind of resources to the system, but over time, those will retire as they age, right? So we can see that black line increasing and then decreasing. So to meet that planning reserve margin, we're going to need some incremental resource needs. So new resource investments that the capacity expansion modeling activity is going to help us identify in terms of what is the minimum least cost resource portfolio to kind of fill that gap to meet our planning reserve margin while meeting those requirements I talked about. Next slide. So much like with our resource adequacy conversation, the kind of planning and capacity expansion paradigm is also becoming more complex as it evolves, as we see new resources and technology and new planning requirements for our systems. So on the left, again, I have kind of our old paradigm, and on the right, kind of our new or modern paradigm. Really quickly, just on the left, this is maybe what we've all a lot heard about or learned about in school if we went this route. And illustratively, there was a heuristic approach kind of to providing a reasonable means of evaluating the resource needs and investment options for a system. And what that really did was just take kind of a load duration curve, so kind of how many hours we might see certain loads over a year, which is in the figure down below. So we see, those really high load area, really high load periods, in a number of hours, but not as much as, just the base or lower load conditions. So we can stack up as with this curve, kind of our base load resources. What do we need to meet that base that's consistent throughout the year? Some intermediate resources and then some peaking resources. And these kind of align with what Emmanuel was describing earlier, our nuclear or those thermal resources we keep on all the time that maybe have decreased, not so high variable costs, but maybe higher fixed costs or, capital costs. And then as we go up towards our peaking resources, these might be smaller resources, smaller capital costs, but they have a much higher variable cost. So we don't want to keep them on at all hours. So there's this trade-off here of just the capital intensive resources with those lower operating costs that meet our base load needs, and then the higher operating cost peaking resources that maybe have lower capital costs to kind of meet our need. We're transitioning from this old paradigm now, to this new paradigm, in EP and mini systems across the continent, as we're seeing new resources, wind, solar, and storage come online. And as we do this, we can see that we're no longer, just stacking baseload, intermediate, and peaking resources. We have these kind of intermittent variable resources that can meet portions of our load throughout a day. For example, here we're seeing kind of just a 24-hour dispatch of different resources. So here we need to better understand kind of system dispatch and resource or technology capabilities at a more granular time scale, not just looking at an annual load duration curve, but looking at hourly time steps potentially, or chronological time steps across our year, in order to capture the constraints on kind of like operational flexibility between these resources. So we want to reflect, that solar isn't available, 24 hours a day, and that wind may come in certain hours, and that storage can contribute in certain periods. So flagging here that we will be looking at EPE system, not just one peak, but the peak across the peak load, across the year, and also that hourly load requirement across the year. Next slide. In addition to the different paradigms, we're also seeing, drivers of complexity in capacity expansion planning. And we've talked about all of these, and I'm, really reiterating or, hammering on these, but, reliability we talked about earlier is really important for systems, and becoming more of, something that we're paying attention to in the news, et cetera. But we really want that consistent and stable provision of power. And we are integrating more diverse resources. So we need to understand how to evaluate those and model them to ensure that we're getting the sufficient reliability in our plans. Policies, right? We have different policies in New Mexico for EPE's system, such as our RPS there. So we need to make sure that we're meeting those policy requirements. Technology, as we talked about in the last presentation from Emmanuel, the menu of technology options is expanding, and we need to understand these and reflect them in the model. And then the economics, right? Maybe supply chain doesn't initially trigger economics, but that's also a cost, right? So, major changes in costs and fuel of technologies as they come down, fluctuations over the, in different years with supply chain. So we have to kind of reevaluate, what resources and how much they cost, and are they feasible for the time horizon we're looking at. So yeah, lots of drivers. Some of these are on the supply side. So, our little friend here, is looking up and thinking, how do I plan for EPE? And it's thinking about these firm resources that can include nuclear, fossil, geothermal, some energy limited resources, that storage, DR, hydro, are like economic renewables, the variable resources, solar, wind. But then we can't forget also the demand side. So our distributed energy resources, demand response, load management activities that we talked about previously. So we have to think about all of this and balance this while we're making these decisions as well. Next slide. In terms of capacity expansion modeling, here I want to flag kind of how this is formulated. So before I talked about what it does, but here I just want to touch on a few things here. First off is, we're trying to meet our needs at least cost. So our capacity expansion modeling is essentially, it has an objective function on the left here at the bottom to minimize costs. So it's considering our investment costs and new resources, generation, transmission, the fixed costs, like how much, fixed costs for these resources, and then also our variable costs, for some of these resources like thermal, for example.
Nate, we've lost your audio.
By trading off investment costs and investment options with a number of constraints here on the right. Oh,
Hey, Ben.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Your video is frozen, but your
Can you hear me
audio.
now? Okay. Can we, we'll go back here. I'm not sure where I cut off, but I'll quickly summarize this by saying that we're minimizing an objective function of costs by making a number of decisions of trading off the investment options of different resources and how they may operate, while adhering to a number of potential constraints. These are not specific to EPE, but may include kind of our REA, RPS targets, reliability, limits to resources that we can add, transmission, operations, and then other policy constraints. I would say at a high level, what we're really doing here is we're trying to minimize costs by adding resources to make sure that we are meeting all of our future planning requirements. Next slide. Next slide. Oh. And then for all of those mathematically minded people out here, what I really want to emphasize here is, minimize portfolio costs. So what we're looking at is EPE's system and portfolios that include, their existing plan and those candidate resources. And we want an optimal portfolio. So kind of this lowest point on this purple curve, which essentially represents the total of our investment and fixed costs, so that black line, and our fuel and variable costs at any moment or over the horizon. And we want to identify that optimal, the lowest cost point on that purple curve for our investment and resources and the operation of these resources. If that's helpful for anybody in terms of least cost. So in summary, capacity expansion modeling is meant to really inform our future resource decisions and the portfolio that our system may grow towards. By identifying that optimal portfolio, minimizing costs while of course maintaining reliability and achieving our other kind of clean energy and other policy targets. I will note that every system is different, right? And the results for EPE's current IRP will be different from past and future studies, but also will be different from other utilities that you see, right? Each utility has, its specific kind of territory and, the loads that are represented there, but also resource availability and different, policy requirements, et cetera. So while we might see, certain resources being added, in some utilities, we may see different resources being, the optimal for EPE, but overall, we should be, planning for that kind of least cost resource portfolio that meets our requirements or constraints. Great. I'll pause there for questions. Did I miss anything there, Ben?
Great, thank you, Nate. Look, we do have some time for questions, and I think, Kathy, with your assistant, I think we have a first question from Orland. Unless and I see Don Kurtz, you have your hand up. Let's go to Orland first, and then to Don. So, Orland, are you still on?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, there he is.
Hang on, I'm sorry. Your connections are cutting in and out for me, but yeah, I did want to ask about your virtual power plants. And so I was just curious, what are the physical resources you all plan to utilize for your virtual power plants, and to what degree are you guys going into those?
Hey, Orland. Sorry, we're still having some audio issue here.
There we go.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Orland, just maybe to answer that question, I think that's going to be subject to discussion during the third and fourth stakeholder meetings. When we start looking at the scenario requests from stakeholders, we can start discussing those alternatives to supply side resources. So those virtual power plants, other DER solutions, load management solutions. So I think that's still to be determined probably in the third and fourth stakeholder meetings.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Dawn, go ahead, please.
Can we look at slide 45 for a moment? I just have a question here. Something I've been curious about, it notes that there's renewable curtailment due to oversupply. And I wonder what that means for resource planning, because a lot of the gas plants are essentially curtailed all but a few hours a year. And so what's different about solar here? That we make a note of it and et cetera.
Well, I think that the difference here is with the gas plants, you say they're curtailed, all but a few times a year. I think what you're referring to is they're not operating a few times a year.
Right.
Whereas with the solar resources, they're essentially must-take resources, right? So if they can produce, they will produce unless the utility makes the decision to turn them off. So what we're trying to highlight in this graph on the right-hand side is unless you have load management systems in place, or unless you have significant amounts of storage to take this renewable generation, it's essentially going to be clipped or wasted or curtailed, however you want to describe it.
But I mean, what is it a problem that it's being wasted?
Not necessarily. No, it could still be part of the lowest cost solution. So by no means does the model solve to zero curtailment. To Nate's point earlier, it solves to the lowest cost. And that lowest cost may have curtailment of solar resources embedded within it. But if those curtailments become too high, what the model is likely going to do, it's probably going to add more storage, right? It's going to add more storage to prevent those curtailments from occurring. So there's always going to be an optimal amount of curtailment on the system.
I worry that that's not a good way to do it because it seems like it's being wasted. Well, so is the capacity again of an oil plant. I mean, it seems like I don't think going immediately to battery to fix the situation. It should also be included just to, hey, let it be curtailed.
Well, and to be clear, Mr. Curtis, it absolutely can let it be curtailed. The model is going to look at the lowest cost overall solution, and it's going to say, is it better to curtail that solar generation? Or is it more cost effective to increase fixed costs by building additional storage with the understanding you're then going to benefit from that curtailed, that what would have been curtailed otherwise? So that's all part of the logic that goes into this model to calculate the lowest cost solution.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, so what you're saying is both scenarios are considered and yeah, then great. That
Yeah.
makes sense. That was my question. Thank you very much.
And
Great. Go ahead.
I was just gonna, yeah, I was gonna add. You gotta turn your audio up. Sorry, it's time to go. Don, I would also add, like, the word waste is probably a little pessimistic or negative there. And I would say that, we've often seen that, there are economic levels of curtailment, right? So it's going to trade that off. So I'm not trying to be negative there about the curtailment. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And at this point, I do want to open up questions on any presentations from today that folks have questions. I mean, certainly we can talk more about this capacity expansion, but if there are other questions, I see Carrie, over hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if batteries are put into the baseload resources category.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we have maybe a terminology problem here. But no, the batteries are not part of the base load. We don't just turn them on and let them dispatch over, long periods of time. You can see them, they're actually in purple on the graph here. We call it storage. It's sometimes batteries, sometimes battery energy storage, sometimes storage. But storage is essentially, we look up here, when there is this kind of excess solar that could be curtailed above the load line, you can see there that surplus solar kind of charges the storage. And then we use that storage to shift that excess, renewable resource to kind of the peak period. So it's kind of, coming in when some of our other renewable resources or that net load, kind of that net peak hour comes on. So I would consider it more, helping to address that, net peak there.
Okay, and are you creating storage only from wind and solar, or are you able to, or does EP want to create storage from other resources as well?
So the way we're modeling storage right now, Ms. Lynch, is essentially the system can charge the batteries. So the technology is kind of agnostic to what's charging the batteries. It would be just charged based on whatever the lowest cost resource is at the time.
Okay, so they aren't actually, the storage isn't actually connected to a specific type of resource. It's connected to the system in general.
It's a complicated question, which has some kind of caveats to the response. But largely speaking, even though the solar and storage is often physically located together, after the Inflation Reduction Act of 22 was passed, there was no longer a requirement where the storage had to be charged by the solar to qualify for the ITC. So now what you typically see is the storage, the battery, is available to charge just on whatever the grid is producing at the time.
That said, you would typically not charge during your most expensive, thermal heavy hours, right? The model is minimizing costs. So it will choose to charge the storage in the lowest cost hours. And that most likely aligns when you have surplus renewables, Kara.
Okay,
Yeah, so-
thanks for the.
Yeah, no, good, Karen. If we go back to slide 34, Orland points out that maybe we have a terminology challenge here because we've got battery 4 and 8 hour lithium ion shown as firm resources.
It is a firm resource, meaning that we can dispatch it when we want. Firm is not synonymous with base load. So I want to clarify that. Base load means a resource that you turn on and may operate over extended periods of time, right? It's not going to vary much like your nuclear. But nuclear is also, considered a firm resource because it is typically available when you need it. So batteries, right? You can dispatch them if they're charged. You are able to dispatch them in the hours that you need them. So firm is not synonymous with base load capacity. Orlando, hopefully that clarifies that.
Yeah, I was just curious, usually I think I've seen your battery capacities as a single value in prior IRPs. So that durational component is so critical. But for firm resources, I'm curious, that's a percentage of your you need to support your load with those batteries to put it in the firm resources box. I'm not certain that I agree with that, but I guess I would need more qualification there, or quantification, I should say. So
yeah, I think what we see typically, this may change. We often evaluate the ELCC of storage together with solar and wind. So you could call it like an ELCC resource, Orlando. And of course, that ELCC will diminish potentially as we bring more and more of these batteries online. And maybe that is maybe what you're referring to, right? Like it becomes less of a firm resource as you saturate, the system with it, just because, you need longer and longer durations to meet that net peak that's
wouldn't ELCC increase if with more batteries? It would be, you've got an effective load carrying capacity. If you've got more batteries on the system, you should have more capacity.
That's a good question, Orlando. Maybe that's a mistake on my explanation, but the total portfolio ELCC that you have on as you add more batteries, right? Your ELCC of that battery portfolio will increase, but that marginal ELCC that you get out of the next megawatt of battery that you add will decrease, right? You're not going to get the same.
Sure. Okay. I gotcha.
Okay. Thanks, Orlando.
Great. Thank you. I understand, Cynthia, you've got a question. You'd like to come off mute and state your question, please?
Yes, follow up to Orland's point or question about VPPs, and he was asking EPE what physical resources they were going to use to model VPPs. And I think, Ben, you punted it to the workshops 4 through 7 when we get into sensitivity design. And you said something to the effect about, you know, that might be part of I interpreted you as saying that might be a stakeholder sensitivity. And I just wanted to say that from staff's perspective, one of the things we've been talking about is now with EPE making such advance already on their AMI meter installations, you've got, I don't know, quite a few on your system already, and then you've got another annual report coming up just the 1st of March on your AMI build out. What we're interested in, and then particularly for the New Mexico jurisdiction, you know, when you've got this extreme run up in peak load and it's weather related, how are you taking demand response, distributed resources, virtual power plants, and creating a strategic resource for peak requirements and distribution grid reliability, and not something that stakeholders are going to bring to you and try and get you to model, but is this an evolution or a next generation step we can expect to see in this IRP? And then in particular, is there a way that staff can work with you, you know, starting now and as we go along to the September filing to bring this along?
Yeah, so let me jump in there first, Cynthia, and then we can turn this over to EP if they want to correct or clarify here. But just real quickly, the reason why we typically recommend talking about DER solutions as a broader group is because the model typically doesn't pick them based purely on economics, right? You usually have economies of scale where the model is going to select utility scale, solar, utility scale storage before it picks, you know, rooftop solar, rooftop storage, right? So the model alone typically doesn't solve this solution. So that means EPE or the utility in question has to come up with the solution themselves. How much do we think is the optimal amount of distributed energy resources we should add to the system? Now that, to me, isn't easy to do in a vacuum. And I know we've got a lot of really smart, really interested people on this call from either the staff or from DER advocate groups. So it would be great when we have that conversation in Las Cruces to be able to get people's thoughts, kind of brainstorm together, and then come up with a consolidated approach, to a DER solution. So I don't think I'm necessarily, Cynthia, suggesting that this has to be a stakeholder request. I think I'm more suggesting it requires stakeholder discussion and input more than maybe just a typical supply side resource scenario.
Okay, and I understand that. Also, though, I think this is really a matter that's almost outside of a 20-year IRP planning horizon. When you look at, for the New Mexico jurisdiction, that incredible load run up in peak demand that you're having 2026, 2027, and then it, you know, starts to level off. I guess the question I have is, where can we best have this conversation about when are you going to be able to start doing some real demand response with your AMI meter network and bring down that peak load through load management?
Yeah, and I maybe will hand that piece of the question off to the EP folks.
Right, and that's not really a question to answer here. Let's be clear about that. But that's something that we see as one way of really addressing an affordability issue for New Mexico.
Yeah, so I'm that great point, Cynthia, and I am suggesting that we do discuss that within the IRP conversation, because it is important, a part of the planning horizon. And so we will definitely have those specific conversations starting in Las Cruces on March 11th. So And I think there are, as Ben said, there are people in this group on the call today that have some particular interests and ideas in this regard as well. So we will facilitate that discussion to help guide the modeling runs that happen by the EPE and E3 team. So thank you for raising those questions. Do we have other questions that I don't see any other hands up, but Kathy, tell me if I've missed something in the chat.
No, I think our cue is thank you everybody for the direct exchange and bringing your questions to the team.
Margie, do you mind if I just make one clarification or elaboration on our earlier presentation?
Please do.
So Nate mentioned earlier that the model is going to solve to the least cost solution, and that is 100% correct. That's what the model is going to do. The least cost solution, though, I just want to identify, is not necessarily the optimal solution. Okay, so after we complete the analysis, we then typically look at the results of the analyses and try and identify any areas of risk, for example, any future potential issues with the plan, how dependent is the plan on market sales, for example. So there's a whole post-processing evaluation that goes through the modeling. And I just want to make it very clear that the least cost solution is not necessarily the optimal solution and not necessarily what should be the recommended solution.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Steve, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just two quick things. Cynthia from staff, thank you. You raised a really important issue. And glad to hear staff is on top of that, so thank you. Second, we talked about this, Margie. I was wondering if for those people who wanted to participate, we could create a contact list, again, just for folks who want to participate, so that if we want to chat with a particular participant on an issue between meetings, we can reach them easily.
Yeah, so let me just remark on that. So GridWorks' past policy has been to not share contact email lists among all stakeholders because we respect your privacy and resist the temptation for spam. So we do not make the distribution list available to everyone. As Steve is suggesting, if there are people that wish to be contacted by other stakeholders, please let us know and we can put you in touch. Or as Steve is suggesting, if people are interested in making their contact information available to the rest of the stakeholders, you can let us know that as well, and we can put together a list of those who wish to be on a sort of an outside distribution list. But please let us know if you'd like to be in a group that shares email lists among yourselves. Otherwise, we can certainly put you in touch. If you say, hey, I really would like to talk to XYZ person on this, we can let XYZ new person know that you'd like to talk with them and make an introduction that way. So we're happy to do the brokering of contacts or put together a broader list. Please let us know either in the chat or offline by email if you would like to be included in an email list that shares emails with others. Thanks, Steve, for bringing that up. Dawn, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Steve said and just to be thinking about it, I wonder, I appreciate the chance to see the chat go by and see what people are thinking about, et cetera. I don't know, in your experience, whether it would be useful or cumbersome to have a kind of an ongoing place where we could make comments for you and E3 and other stakeholders and GridWorks and APE, just to be thinking about the kinds of issues that we're bringing up, or are we trying to save that for the meetings?
Yeah, if you have a specific suggestion, let us know. We want to be very conscious of inclusion of, everybody who's been, who wants to be part of this process. So if you have a suggestion, let us know. Otherwise, we're going to plan to accommodate those conversations during the workshops and not outside of the workshops. It just creates another, chain of actions and follow-ups that make it a little difficult, but we're certainly open to suggestions.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's up to you all how you handle it, but my suggestion would be, I remember in the previous IRP, there was just kind of an ongoing thing that we could comment on, and El Paso Electric would occasionally answer it or not, and it was just having ideas, but I don't know which is best, but I just wondered if you consider that and see if you think it's a good idea or not.
Okay, we'll kick that around with the EPE team. Thanks, Dawn.
Thank you.
Kara, please go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I have two questions. The first one refers to slide 33. I was wondering what customer dedicated facilities might be.
Emmanuel, do you want to take that one?
That is the name given to the latest expansion for our community solar. So I believe is that 10 New Mexico, 30 Texas? That's
30 New Mexico.
30, the 40 megawatts that you see there, that's 30 megawatts for New Mexico, 10 for Texas.
Okay, great. And then my next question was procedurally related to these meetings. CCAE has different members located in different places, some in New Mexico, some in EPE territory, some not. I'm not. It would take a lot of resources for me to go down there, probably end up staying the night. And I'm wondering, can we host the next meeting or any in-person meeting in a hybrid fashion?
So the next workshop will be hybrid, though. The next workshop, and I'll get to that in a moment, at March 11th, it will be hybrid. We are strongly encouraging in-person participation because these conversations, especially around modeling details, are best accommodated in person. But the one in Las Cruces on the 11th will also be hybrid. There will be some limited opportunities to engage virtually through Zoom in that workshop. We're currently designing that workshop to provide some virtual participation, but I can promise you it will be disappointing in that it won't be the same to be in person. So I hear your concern, Kara. We've tried to consider that and provide these virtual meetings for broad participation and hybrid, but also accommodate these conversations that really are going to need to happen in person, both on the 11th of March and then later in the process in perhaps August, where we're really nailing down the statement of need and action plan. And those are best accommodated with as many people as can be in the room in person. So we'll take your suggestion to heart. Please know that there will be a virtual option for portions of the workshop on March 11th.
Okay. And, I just asked that because I'm one person of the coalition, and I'm not a modeler, but we have modeling expertise. I just don't know who can be there,
Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you for reminding us of that consideration.
Yes.
Are there other questions on any topic before we go to summarize what we've done today and where we're going next? Seeing none, I'd like to very much thank the EPE E3 team for your fabulous information and question fielding responses. This has been, I think, quite helpful for those who are new to the process, but also those who are experienced to really understand the nuances of what you're dealing with in this complex planning process. So great big round of applause for EP, E, and E3. And now I'd like to offer some thoughts about what's going to happen next. So today we got to hear more information about a large suite of topics. That's to make sure our knowledge together is of a shared foundation. We know we have details to get into more on the modeling. We also know that there are some people part of the process who want to stay engaged at perhaps a higher level and not get into the details. So we are designing workshop number 3 to have 2 tracks. And that workshop in Las Cruces with a hybrid option will provide some general education and some exercises for those who want to still increase their knowledge and be engaged at a high level. And we'll also have a track on detailed modeling breakout for conversations about specific input values, specific scenarios and sensitivities. We'll ask EPE to do a presentation on sensitivities and scenarios for everybody, and then we'll engage in an exercise to begin to have the conversation Ben alluded to, which is to have people with some common ideas about sensitivities and scenarios to get together around a table and start to narrow down the parameters for such runs. So we'll have 2 tracks in April. We'll have some limited opportunities to engage via Zoom, and we will also have some portions of that workshop where the 2 tracks inform each other. We will do some exchange of information between the modeling group and the general education group. So we'll try to tie everything together so that both groups can inform each other, and you don't have to be in 2 places at one time. So that will be on March 11th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'll have provided lunch and coffee at 8:30, but Deborah Shields will be sending you all a meeting invitation. We'd ask that you RSVP specifically whether you're going to attend in person or virtually, so it can make sure that we accommodate your attendance in either of those methods. We are working with EPE to put dates together for the April and future workshops, but we anticipate that April workshop will be all virtual, and we'll pick up on where we left after workshop 3 in coming back with EPE, and they'll have a chance to process those scenario and sensitivity suggestions by stakeholders. And then we will launch into the May-July timeframe, which is really where the heavy modeling and feedback and discussions will occur before we get ready for the last phase, where in workshop 8, we're also planning to be a hybrid, but encourage attendance in person. Then late September, after the IRP is filed, we will engage you all hopefully in a virtual setting to get your feedback on how this process worked, what should be done differently, etc. So that's our plan for going forward. At this point in our process, it would be very helpful for anybody who is planning to attend the March workshop, either virtually or in person. And if you have topics that you specifically want to cover, particularly for folks who are new or want to do some general education or higher level discussions, please feel free to put in the chat at this point topics that you would like to spend time on. We know the modeling group has lots to talk about, and we'll work closely with the EPE and E3 team to structure that constructively. But for those of you who want to refrain from that technical detail and just kind of want to hear the output but don't want to see the sausage being made, we'd like to hear from you on topics that you would like to cover in this general education track. So feel free to put your ideas in the chat, and if something comes to you in the next week, feel free to email that to us as well, and we'll factor that into the design for workshop number 3. Deb, could you show the next slide, and then we'll open questions. Again, next steps, we'll create a summary from this workshop, and distribute it out before the end of this week. That will all also be posted on our website. We've been alerted that a couple of the slides from EPE, the graphics didn't translate to PDF properly on the portion on that document that we posted. So we will update that presentation from today to make sure all those graphics are included. And then I just spoke about workshop 3. It'll be at the Doña Ana County Government Center. Here's the schedule that we talked about. We mentioned the in-person attendance if possible. We'll have some Zoom participation with limited interaction opportunities. And again, those who are new to the process or would like to specify topics for the general education track, please let us know. With that, I would like to, Deb, go ahead and please go to the last slide. Deb has got, if you could put into the chat also a link to the website where people can get the presentations. We will update the EPE set so that you've got all the proper graphics. And we do have time for any other last questions before we adjourn. So if you have other questions, please come raise your hand and we'll call on you. Otherwise, we will adjourn. But are there any questions at this point? Great. I see folks are adding topics to be hear more about, so we'll take note of that. And a huge thank you to all the stakeholders who participated today and for offering your questions, your thoughts, your comments. It's been extremely helpful. I think we've met our objective of exchanging information and building a community of collaborative conversation about the 20-year plan. So thank you very much for being here. I know your time is precious, and we will give you a few minutes back to enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Again, thank you so much, and we'll see you hopefully in Las Cruces in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.